At 6:10 in the morning, 2 hours before the sale started, a man walked out into the wet grass at the end of the machinery row, put his hand flat on a piece of iron the size of a kitchen range, and stood there. He did not walk round it. He did not look underneath. He put one palm down on the top of it and left it there. And after about a minute, he took his hat off and held it in his other hand, which nobody who saw it could account for at all. His name was Emmet Crole, and he was 58 years old. What he had his hand on was an anvil. Now hold on to that word for a second, because it is doing all the work here. Everybody knows what an anvil is. You have seen 100 of them in cartoons. It is the thing that falls out of the sky. It sits in the corner of every blacksmith shop that has ever been drawn. It is the size of a large dog. And if you have ever actually picked one up, you know that a good farrier's anvil weighs about 150 pounds and takes 2 men and some swearing to get onto a stand. This one weighed 12 tons, 24,000 pounds of cast steel sitting half sunk into the ground at a consignment sale outside Sandusky, Ohio, with the earth pushed up around its base where it had settled over the years and dry weeds growing against the side of it. It was a squat rectangular block, roughly 5 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet on a broad stepped base, with one heavy squared horn and a flat working face that was scarred all over in a way that a man who knew what he was looking at could read like a page. The catalog gave it 5 words: large anvil block, sold where is. And at about 6:20, before anybody else was in the field, Emmet Crole took a 2-pound hammer out of his coat pocket and hit it. That is the oldest test there is, and it has never been improved on. A sound block rings. You strike the face, and the note comes up through the steel and hangs in the air for a second or two clear, like a bell that somebody is trying not to let you hear. A cracked block thuds. There is no other word for it. The note dies where it started, because a crack anywhere in the mass eats the ring. And once you have heard the difference, you can never mistake it again. He hit it in 4 places: the face, both sides, and the base. It rang in all 4. He put the hammer back in his pocket, and that was the entire inspection. And it was worth more than any amount of looking, and it is the reason he was standing there at 6:10 instead of at 9 like everybody else. And here is the thing I want you to be wondering about for the next 20 minutes, because it is the actual mystery of this story, and it is not the one you think. It was not cheap because it was broken. It was not cheap because nobody wanted it. It was cheap because of where it was standing. Nobody in that field understood that, including, at 6:10 in the morning, Emmet Crole. He worked it out 4 months later, in the rain, with an engineer's report in his hand, and it turned $55 into $141,000, and I am going to make you wait for it. The bidding, when it finally came round to that lot, took about 90 seconds, and most of that was the auctioneer talking. He opened at $400 and got nothing. He came down in steps, the way they do, and the crowd enjoyed it the way crowds do. And at $55, Emmet Crole lifted one finger, and Junie Wexler wrote it in the book, and the ring moved on to a hay elevator. $55 for 12 tons of cast steel. Dorsey Pruitt, who buys iron by the ton for a yard over in Fremont, and who is a perfectly decent man, told him afterwards that he had just bought about $2,900 of scrap and a problem worth considerably more than that. And by his arithmetic, he was not wrong, and that is the part everybody misses about Dorsey Pruitt. He was not being stupid. He was applying the only arithmetic anybody in that field had. If you've made it this far into Emmet Crole's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. So, what is a forging anvil, and why does one weigh 12 tons? A farrier's anvil is a tool you hit things on. A forging anvil is not that. A forging anvil is the bottom half of a machine. When a drop hammer or a steam hammer comes down on a piece of hot steel, the energy in that blow has to go somewhere, and there are only two places it can go. It goes into the work, which is what you want, or it goes into the ground, which is what you do not want. A light anvil moves. Not much, not visibly, but it moves, and every fraction of an inch it moves is a piece of your blow that went into shaking the county instead of shaping your steel. So the mass under the hammer is the whole trade. The old rule of thumb in a forge shop is that you want somewhere between 15 and 20 times the weight of the falling hammer sitting underneath it. And that is why an anvil block for a serious hammer is not a tool you carry. It is a foundation with a working face on top. This one was cast in 1911, and the maker's name was still readable in raised letters down one side, and that works had stopped existing in 1958. And here was the first thing Emmet Crole knew that morning that nobody else in the field did. Nobody makes these anymore. Not they are expensive. Not there is a waiting list. There is essentially no commercial production of large cast steel anvil blocks in North America, and there has not been for decades, because the market for them died with the shops that used them, and the pattern equipment and the foundry capacity went with it. What exists is what exists. When one is cut up, that is one fewer forever. Between about 1960 and about 2000, most of them went for scrap. A shop closed, a building was cleared, and the cheapest thing to do with 12 tons of steel in a pit is to cut it where it lies and weigh it in. Nobody wrote any of that down. It happened one building at a time on Tuesdays for 40 years. And before a shop will hang a hammer over a block, there are 4 things it has to have. And they are not negotiable, and there is no way to fake any of them. It has to have mass in the right ratio to the hammer. Too little, and you are shaking the building instead of moving steel. It has to be sound all the way through, not sound on the face where you can see it. Sound at the bottom of the pit, in the dark, where a crack starts and where nobody will look at it again for 30 years. It has to have a face that can be dressed. A working face wears, and every so often it is machined flat again, and a block that has already been dressed 4 or 5 times has no meat left to give. And it has to sit on ground that will not move. 3 of those 4 are properties of the object. Everybody in this story understood those 3. The 4th is not a property of the object at all, and almost nobody thinks about it until it is far too late, and it is the one this entire story turns on. Now here is the second thing, and it is the one that makes the story. About 400 miles east, in a valley in Pennsylvania, a drop forge shop was down to its last usable anvil block. Rinaldo Sykes was 63, and he had run that shop for 26 years. It was not a big operation, 19 people. What it did was make forged parts to order in small numbers, which sounds unglamorous until you understand what a small number of forged parts actually keeps running. Drag lines, lock gates, older presses, rolling mill housings. A great deal of equipment built between 1930 and 1970 that is still working. That will keep working more or less forever if it can get spares. And that cannot get spares from anywhere else because nobody makes them and the drawings are in a filing cabinet. He had 3 hammers. 2 of them were down because their blocks had failed in the way blocks fail, which is a crack that opens from the bottom of the pit where nobody can see it until the day the ring goes flat. and he had 11 months of order book and no way to fill it. He had been calling around North America since the previous autumn, asking a question that got shorter every time he asked it. Do you have a block? Nobody had a block. Then, somebody sent him a photograph from an Ohio consignment sale of a lean man in overalls with his hat in his hand and his palm flat on 12 tons of 1911 cast steel. The call came on a Sunday evening in March. Emmet Crole listened to nearly all of it without saying anything, and then asked one question, and the question was not about money. He asked what the hammer weighed. Sykes told him a 3,000-pound falling weight. There was a pause, and then Emmet Crole said 12 tons was 8 times that, and that the rule was 15, and asked him what he was proposing to do about the other 7. That is the moment Rinaldo Sykes decided he was dealing with somebody who knew exactly what he had. He said so later in as many words. He said most people selling him iron did not know what a ratio was. Emmet Crole had 3 questions of his own, and he wrote them on the back of an envelope that night, and they get answered one at a time across the following year, out of order, and not one of them is about price. The first was whether the face had anything left. A block that has been dressed down past its hardened layer is finished, and you cannot tell by looking, because a worn face and a fresh one look identical under 60 years of scale. The second was how it had been used. An anvil that has spent its life under a hammer doing the same job in the same place wears evenly. One that has been moved and reset and packed and re-leveled by different men over decades has a history in it, and the history is written as uneven wear across the face. And it is the closest thing that trade has to a service record. The third he did not know how to ask properly, and it was simply, why is this here? Why is 12 tons of irreplaceable steel standing in wet grass in a consignment sale with a 5-word description? Things of real value do turn up in strange places, not usually for no reason. He answered the first that same week with a file and a hardness tester borrowed from a machine shop in Norwalk, and the answer was that there was better than 1.5 inches of good material left, which is 3 or 4 more dressings and more life than he had. The second took him until the report came back. The third took him until the day he stood in his own field with an engineer. They talked for an hour. The number they arrived at was $141,000 for the block, delivered and set, which sounds enormous until you set it against the alternative, and the alternative was that a 19-person shop with an 11-month order book closed. And that is where a shorter story ends. Man buys thing for $55, sells it for $141,000. Everybody at the auction looks foolish. Roll credits. That is not what happened. What happened is that the ground said no, because a 12-ton Anvil block does not go on a floor. It goes on a mass foundation, a poured pit, usually with timber or spring packing under the block, sunk into ground that can carry the load and, much more importantly, will not settle unevenly under 30 years of hammering. An anvil that settles 1/2 inch out of level is worse than no anvil at all. So before anybody moved anything, the shop's insurers did the entirely correct thing and had the site assessed. And the borings came back, and the borings were bad. That valley floor is fill, old canal-cut filled in the 1890s with whatever was to hand, which in that part of Pennsylvania meant slag. Cinder and construction spoil. The existing pit had been in since 1948 and had settled 1 1/4 inches over its life, which the shop had corrected twice with packing and had stopped thinking about. You cannot put 12 tons of new mass on that and hammer it 200 times a minute. The engineer's estimate for making the site good piles to rock, a new mass block, the works came in at $390,000 against a $141,000 Anvil. Rinaldo Sykes called Ohio in June and said the words that end most stories like this one. He said they had to step back from it. Now, Emmet Crole was 58. He had 12 tons of steel in the field. He had spent $55 and about $1,900 getting it home, and the only buyer on the continent had just walked away for reasons that had nothing to do with him and that he could not fix. Dorsey Pruitt, to his credit, did not gloat. He came out and made a serious offer, and it was a good one, and it was $9,400 with a cutting crew arriving in a fortnight. That is 170 times what Emmet Crole had paid. On a straight return, it is the best thing that had ever happened to him. He asked for a month. And what he did with that month is the reason I wanted to tell you this. He went and looked at his own field. Not the anvil, the field. The 4 acres behind his shop where the thing had been sitting since March, where a low loader had put it down because that was the only spot the crane could reach, and where it had settled about 1/4 of an inch in the first fortnight and then, as far as anybody could measure, stopped. He borrowed a level and some stakes, and he checked it every week for a month, and it did not move again. Then he did something that a lot of men would not have thought of. He paid $2,200 of his own money for borings. Nell Arbuckle came out and put 3 holes down and came back with the report, and the report said this: 31 feet of dense glacial till overshale bedrock, dry, with no fill anywhere in the profile and no history of anything ever having been dug there. She told him it was, without exaggeration, about the best natural foundation you could ask for in that part of Ohio, and that it was the reason somebody had chosen that spot for a works in 1911 in the first place. And then she did something she did not have to do. She walked over to the block and put her own hand flat on the working face and left it there. He asked her what she was doing, and she said she wanted to feel whether it was warm. It was. Steel that size holds the day's heat well into the evening and gives it back slowly, and what she was actually feeling was 24,000 pounds of thermal mass sitting on ground that had not moved since the ice left. She said, and this is the sentence Emmet Crole repeated to me twice, "This is not a thing you have got. This is a place you have got." That also answered his third question, the one he had not known how to ask. Why was it cheap? Not because it was worn, and not because it was cracked, and not because anybody had ever tested it and found it wanting. It was cheap because it was 12 tons in a field, and every single person who looked at it, the estate, the auctioneer, the ring. The scrap buyer had priced the cost of taking it away and subtracted that from the value of the steel. They had all, without exception, priced its immovability as a liability. Every one of them was working from the same assumption, and the assumption had been correct for 40 years and had eaten almost every one of these blocks in the country, that an anvil is a thing you own. And a thing you own is a thing you can move. And Emmet Crole, who is not a quick man and who does not pretend to be, sat with that for about a day and a half and then called Pennsylvania and said the sentence that turned the entire thing over. He said, "Then do not move it. Move the hammer." Sit with that a second. Everybody in this story, from the auctioneer to the scrap buyer to the engineer to Rinaldo Sykes, had been solving the same problem. How do we get 12 tons of steel from here to there? Nobody had asked whether there was any reason for it to go. A drop hammer is a machine. It is heavy and it is awkward and it is not cheap to move, but it is a machine, and machines are made to be installed. The anvil is not a machine. The anvil is the ground. It took 14 months, and it was not simple, and I do not want to make it sound like one clever sentence solved everything, because it did not. Renato Seques had to persuade a board, 19 employees, and an insurer that the correct response to a bad foundation was to put a hammer in another state. The insurer took 5 months on its own. 2 of his people would not go, and he did not blame them, and he found them work in the valley. There was a zoning question that took 11 weeks, because a field behind a blacksmith shop is not on paper an industrial site, and the county had to be walked through what was actually being proposed by a man in overalls and a woman in a hard hat who had by then become quite an effective double act. And there was the block itself, which had to be dressed before anything could sit over it. That meant a portable mill brought in on a trailer and 3 days of very slow cutting to take the top surface back to flat and true, in a field in October under a tarpaulin. Because you cannot machine steel in the rain. Emmet Crole watched the whole of that and said almost nothing. And at the end of it, he ran his hand across the fresh face and told the machinist he had taken 30 thousandths more than he needed to, and the machinist checked, and he had. The shop leased a half-acre of the field. They poured a pit against the block that was already sitting in perfect ground. They moved one hammer out of the valley and set it over 1911 steel. They ran power in. The first forging came off that hammer in the September of the following year, and the reason it happened at all is that a 58-year-old blacksmith spent $2,200. He did not really have to find out that the cheapest thing in that field was the dirt underneath his problem. The $141,000 was paid in the end as a site and equipment deal rather than a sale of the block. Emmet Crole never sold the anvil. He still owns it. He leases the ground it stands on, and he is paid to maintain it, and there is a clause in that agreement, which he asked for himself, that says the block does not leave the site. By the second year, the shop was sending work to Ohio from 41 different customers, because a forge shop with a sound block is a rare enough thing that people find you. And the work that came was not glamorous, and that is exactly the point of it. Gate pins for a lock on a river that has been in service since 1937. A trunnion for a drag line in a quarry in Kentucky. Rolling mill parts for a plant whose original supplier stopped existing before most of its staff were born. None of that is going to be in a museum. All of it is holding up something that would otherwise stop, and every single piece of it exists because a 58-year-old man hit a lump of steel with a 2-pound hammer in wet grass at 6:20 in the morning and heard it ring. Dorsey Pruitt's $9,400 would have been 170 times his money. He turned down $200,000 2 years later from a company that wanted to buy the block outright and move it to Indiana, and he turned it down in one sentence, and the sentence was that they would be buying the wrong half of it. That is the part that took me longest to understand, and it is the whole of this story. For 40 years, the trade lost these blocks one at a time, and every single time. The reason was the same. The building came down, and the block was in the way. The value was always assumed to be in the steel, and the steel was always assumed to be portable, and so when the site went, the block went. And the actual value was never the steel. It was the marriage of 12 tons of 1911 casting and 31 feet of undisturbed glacial till, and you cannot put that on a truck. There is a photograph from the day the first hammer ran. It is a bad photograph, taken on somebody's phone into the light. A lean man in his late 50s in denim overalls is standing at the edge of a new concrete pit in a field in Ohio, in a shop that has a roof and 2 walls and no 3rd wall yet, beside a machine that came 400 miles to reach a piece of iron that came 5 miles and will never go anywhere again. He is not looking at the hammer. He is not looking at the camera. He has his hand flat on the working face, palm down, the way he did at 6:10 on a wet morning 3 years earlier, and he has left it there.